a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. This program is dedicated to exploring Middle Eastern archaeology for what it can tell us about the Bible, how we can understand it and appreciate it. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, along with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, who has been in archaeology since the beginning of time.
Thank you very much.
Long history and former president of La Sierra, President Emeritus. And an interest in the Old Testament. We'll be talking a lot about the Old Testament. And our guest is Dr. Kent Bramlett, who is Assistant Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity, also at La Sierra University. And we are beginning a very ambitious, daunting task of talking about archaeology in the Bible throughout the Bible, book by book. It's actually going to be section by section. And so this, I think, has great promise. I think when people read the Bible, they'd like to know something about what this passage might, how this passage might be connected with archaeology.
And really that's how each of us got into the field of archaeology, I think, is because of our interest in the Bible, our wanting to understand the Bible better. And we saw archaeology as a way of framing that for us.
Right. Now, interest in the Old Testament comes from where, Kent?
Well, from the time I was very young, really. I was interested in the languages that the Bible was written in and the ancient languages which would provide new windows into that time period. And archaeology is this very physical way of getting back into that time period as well.
So all three of us, interest in education in archaeology as well as Bible and Old Testament. And so we begin by thinking about Genesis 1 through 11, which is often called the primeval prologue. It's kind of, I guess we could think about it as kind of prehistory. But let's think about this. I have some questions for you, maybe some definitions. What does that term, primeval prologue, because that's how authors use the term to describe this section. What does that mean? What maybe does it connote to you? And then we're going to get into questions about history and prehistory. And with those are going to come some other terms that we'll talk about later in this particular broadcast. So, primeval prologue, what does that mean? What does that connote to you? We're thinking about the Bible, sacred text, beginning. What does it mean?
I think that's what it means to me, is the beginning of things. You know, the story is connected with how we got here and how it happened and when it was and so on. So it goes back before any of us were around.
And it really establishes sort of our metaphysical place in space and existence. Everything develops from that standpoint, our relationship with God, with the world, where we're going.
I think of the Hebrew term olam, which can mean lots of things. One thing is kind of forever, but it carries the connotation often in the Old Testament of as far as you can imagine or see, either forward in the future or as far as you can see in the past. And so I think that captures some of this notion of the primeval prologue. It really is back there. It's for me, it's a very positive connotation. I mean, it's a family, it's a root story. So I think it carries that idea. Now, if we think about that, along with a term that I think shows up more often, at least in literature and probably in conversations, history, prehistory. Talk about the divide between history and prehistory and what makes each of them important.
You know, prehistory is before we had writing, to me. That writing is the divide. So if you have access to written records from the time that you're talking about, you can talk about history because you're comparing the various writings that are contemporary. But if you go back before writing existed, then that would be prehistory, because historians think of using documentary sources for their work. And so that means that you can have prehistory basically at any time. It depends on the culture, doesn't it? So New Guinea would be a much more recent
right.
prehistory, and so forth, depending on the cultures around the world.
So Middle East, primarily how do we think about the sources of beginning of writing so that we can call it history?
Well, the Sumerians are the first people to write. Egyptologists will possibly they would like to argue that Egypt was first. It's close.
Right.
But it seems that the area of Uruk in lower southern Mesopotamia has the earliest extant writing that we know of. Beginning, of course, with just temple accounts of gifts brought in, and they record, and then they begin using the symbols to represent more and more sounds, and then finally representing the whole structure of language.
Okay.
Would you say 3rd millennium BC
Yeah.
as a time when these early river civilizations invented writing?
Yeah.
Or would you push it a little bit further? Maybe 3,500? Maybe something like that?
Arguments are that the use of symbols began before the full flowering of writing.
Right.
So if we have then literature beginning in the 3rd millennium, perhaps some of the symbolic use precedes that.
So if we're talking prehistory, it's before that time.
Right.
And what does prehistory mean, besides before writing? I mean, what does it suggest to us about life? And how do we get at life if we don't have texts? I mean, we have texts. We have Genesis 1 through 11 that we'll be working with, but it's dealing with a period that we typically think of as prehistory. So how do we work these? I mean, we want archaeology in the Bible. We want them to be linked somehow so that we can learn from them. How do we do that?
The tradition is that we have Moses to thank for these stories, recording these stories, and he wanted an enslaved people who were not educated and who he wanted to move into Palestine. But they wanted to know, what his authority was, where things started and where they came from, and how are we going to go there, and so on. So, if you look at it from the traditional point of view, you would say that these stories help to answer those kinds of questions for an enslaved people, to sort of educate them.
Which leads to another term that specialists use actually quite a bit, and that is etiology. And etiology is a story that, answers questions, explains what we experience in life, and so that's where you get the kind of thing that you just illustrated, I think, with Moses.
I understand that it's a medical term, too. An etiology of a disease tells you where it came from, how it got there, and so on,
And so we have throughout Scripture etiologies, but probably for these times way back, however far that is, way back, that's kind of at the edge of what we can see. We're trying to explain where from there do we have, or what from there do we have now that we're experiencing.
And I think in that context, etiology doesn't have to be a thin, flat, kind of simple, why the snake, in Gilgamesh, the snake sheds its skin. Rather, it's this rich explanation of who we are, where we came from, and answering those fundamental questions. And of course, we see that in ancient Mesopotamia.
We're doing our vocabulary here, and this vocabulary is going to be important for a good deal of Genesis. And we've divided Genesis up to about 6 parts as we're going to be treating them on this program, and certainly in the beginning parts. What about another word which I think in popular use doesn't capture its real meaning, and that's myth. Is that a good word? Is that a 4-letter word? Well, it is, but does it carry those negative connotations? What does it mean?
It's a dangerous word for a lot of us, isn't it? Because many people automatically think false or untrue, or that didn't happen, But the way scholars use it really is as a story, right? It's a synonym for a story that deals with divine interaction with humans, and stories that are extremely important in explaining where we come from and why we're here. So I think that we would like, if we're going to use that word, we would like to make sure people know that we're not talking about a story that isn't necessarily true,
Right.
or something that didn't happen, but it's a kind of story that goes back to beginnings and talks about the interaction of deity with humanity.
Has God, or in the pagan traditions, the gods, has those figures interacting with humanity? I mean, that's what you mentioned.
Right.
So there's something in what is mythos that is real. It's part of, it tries to explain reality, but it does so with this kind of the deities or the deity in the background and that interaction. And I think that's a better definition. And it's not that we use that word a lot, but when it does come up, we ought to treat it for its real meaning, not the more popular ain't so kind of meaning. So. Before we look at Genesis 1 through 11 and think about it kind of as a whole, if we date Abraham, because after Genesis 1 through 11, you get into the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and we'll talk about that in some future edition. We date them, what, end of the third millennium, something like that? So can we just say 2000 or something like that?
Yeah, many put even a little later, time of Hammurabi.
And then what we have at the end of Genesis 1 through 11 is still in the historical period, but it goes back. When you get into the stories of the flood and of creation, we're talking about something that is before, that is out there long before.
I well remember our teacher Siegfried Horn at the Adventist Theological Seminary saying that history really for him began with Abraham, that he couldn't go beyond that in any secure sort of way in terms of a historical account.
Which then adds credence to the way we're thinking about this. And how do we get at it? Well, if it's prehistory, we don't have a written text, how do we get at it? Let's kind of get at an answer to that by looking at what's in front of us, then let's look at the stories, and then let's ask some more questions about, I mean, even, there's another term, anthropology. We've got to come to that because that's used a lot. So
I noticed that you have some of the oldest artifacts that we have at our archaeology center.
Right, and that's to illustrate this primeval, this prehistory. So what are these, Kent?
Well, these are the ones that Larry is referring to. Wonderful artifacts called hand axes, or more precisely Acheulean hand axes. But there's a multi-purpose tool. They're the earliest tools we find if we think of stratigraphy and the layers. These were probably used for butchering carcasses, for skinning, for basically everything that people needed to do.
This is a pre-Swiss Army knife, is that what it is?
We could call it that,
Lots of possibilities.
Yeah.
Kent, you personally found that. You ought to tell the story. Where'd that come from?
It's actually a site that the Madaba Plains Project located at Azraq. It's an oasis in the Jordanian desert to the east of Amman. And because it was a source of water, a lot of wildlife lived in that area, and people made use of those resources. And I think we were trying to examine the geology of the site and established that it was a great Paleolithic
And so the
location.
Traditional dating by people who study these things usually puts it into the, what, 200 to 300,000 category? Is that sort of the
Way back.
range? Way back. So we're going to stick with Olam, and we're going to take this far past what we can see. But I think that's the traditional,
That's the
way
traditional dating, yes.
prehistorians deal with it. So that is an issue of time. We need to talk about time. We get into these early parts of the Bible, and we have to talk about time, so we will. We'll not dodge that. What else do we have here in front of you?
Well, most of these are from the early Bronze Age, which we've already talked about in other sessions, from the 3rd millennium. So this is the time of the pyramids in Egypt. But these are mostly from tomb assemblages, and it's a very typical sort of a nice vessel. I mean, it has these really nicely curved sides, made of basalt, very hard volcanic rock. And we're not entirely sure, but they probably had, in the tombs, offerings in them. But you can also imagine using a a mortar to prepare some of the harder spices and whatnot.
They look like trumpets, don't they? The end of a trumpet.
Yeah, they do. Very flat bases,
Right.
but yeah.
These are actually very beautiful examples.
Oh, these are
that,
spectacular.
most museums would give their eye teeth for.
You're right. And then I think we have some other stone here, Kent, typically Canaanian or Canaanian blade.
Right.
So chipped, actually there's a percussion bulb right on the top of it
Yeah, so
where it's been popped.
once they largely shape it, they would pop it off and then finish the edges. These were used as sickle blades. So they're installed in a wood shaft, and then they would cut the grain. So agricultural societies, this was a very important implement.
And sometimes they would take a jawbone of a large
Right, yeah,
animal
yeah.
and stick those, and so it would be like a scythe or a sickle that would be a convenient place to put those.
And scientists can actually do residue analysis on the sheen that cutting and cutting and cutting of grain can put onto the stone and find out what it was they were cutting. I mean, it's incredible what science tells us these days. And then some pieces. These are simply pieces of flint, limestone. And these are nodules that are formed naturally inside the limestone that is called a flint, and then those are chipped in ways that we just talked about. In fact, that one is. A couple of tablets over here. We'll spend some more time with that in a future broadcast when we actually talk about the creation accounts in Babylonian and Egyptian history. And when we talk about flood accounts, when we're comparing and contrasting them with biblical. And then some other pieces of pottery over here, I think, Kent, all of them from around that early Bronze Age. So we're talking somewhere, maybe pressing 3000 BC, something like that. Maybe especially the very end
Right,
one
the very
here.
thin
The very
edged
thin. It's just a
bowl.
beautiful, beautiful.
They come from a site that's often associated with Sodom, isn't it?
Right, right, that some people do. Okay, one more science question, and then let's look at the text. Anthropology is a science that's been practiced for decades and decades, which helps us get at information beyond history. What kinds of approaches do anthropologists take that might help us understand life in this time period represented by Genesis 1 through 11?
We could illustrate that by talking about our own team at our site. And we figured, you know, the forebears of the people who live here lived on the same terrain. They had the same kind of soil to work with. How do the current people's use of the resources that are in their environment, how do they use it? And can we find any hints as to how their forebears used it? And as we dig, of course, we find how their forebears used it through historical times. And so we have not only the physical remains, but we have textual remains that we can put together and be fairly confident of the way they utilize their resources. But then what do you do when you go back before written records?
Yes.
Then we have what anthropologists are dealing with theories based on the same resources, the forebears of the people that we work with and so on, and they put their best guess together.
Right.
Yeah.
And now anthropology works all the way from prehistory into historic. I mean, we
Right.
still learn a lot from anthropology.
Absolutely.
But you can't get to prehistory without it, right? And the sciences that are now available.
And
to
there are
us,
various
the
kinds of
technologies.
anthropologists, aren't there? There are physical anthropologists who deal with the bones, and there are cultural anthropologists that deal more with the stories
Right.
from the past.
Right.
Yeah.
4 branches traditionally, the
Yeah.
linguistic anthropologists
Right.
and then archaeology.
Right, right.
There's something kind of heady about what we're talking about here that may not seem to apply to this question of how does archaeology relate to the Bible. But in the way scientists work today, we capture insights through these different technologies and constructs, anthropological constructs, that actually can be very helpful. So, okay, we're pulling some high-end sort of language into this, and we don't want to confuse anybody. But what we do want to do is to see how what we learn through these different resources that can help us with these passages, this particular part of the Bible.
Especially when you don't have writing, you know, from the period.
Right.
You've got to pull in as many other resources as you can from other disciplines.
I'm going to show a slide. And it's kind of my outline of Genesis 1 through 11. And I want you to respond to it, okay? So let's talk about the biblical record, and then let's come back and think about, okay, how is it that science and religion, that faith and religion, that science and the Bible interrelate with each other? Because we're looking there. We look at the Bible and we look at the scientific things. So I'm going to look at this slide, which is, or at least could be, a bit complicated. It's not intended to be. It's an attempt to outline a kind of a literary set of patterns that show up in Genesis 1 through 11. And this pattern tends to start with what is good and secure. It doesn't always, but it tends to start there. And then it goes into collapse, or what we would call the fall, in Genesis 2 and 3. And then if we would talk about some kind of escape from that fall. And all of these are about God, okay? And especially the last part where God rescues. So let's just look at it for a minute, and I will put some chapters with this. So these major events in Genesis 1 through 11 starts out beautiful. All is good. I mean, that's Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It starts out good. However, there is collapse, or we could even put the theological term, the fall, the collapsing and yielding to the temptation and the fall of Adam and Eve. But the story, this particular pattern, doesn't end there, because God actually saves them from what he said he would do to them. He said, on the day you eat, you'll die. But God is gracious, and so God rescues. Then we get into chapters 4 and following, and you have Cain and Abel, and the conflict that develops, and so the punishment comes to Cain. He has the mark, but he's protected. So God steps in and rescues and protects. We don't have a complete series here. Lamech is the one who claims that people have injured us slightly. We're going to cut off heads. We're going to cut off arms. And so this pride, this arrogance. But we don't have an end to that one. And then when we get to the story, things seem to be going along okay until sin comes in. The punishment is the flood, and then there is rescue. I mean, there's an ark, and there is rescue of Noah and his family. So again, at the end of each of these series is a divine intervention. We don't have it here, it stops. And then the Tower of Babel, yes, there is destruction and dispersal, but Genesis 1 through 11 ends without a resolution to that, which should lead the reader to the next chapters. And that's where we get the ancestors, the patriarchs and the matriarchs, which do provide divine blessing, the land, the name, the blessing of God, and so on. So even though we just kind of read Genesis 1 through 11 and we think, okay, this is interesting, or not, all the genealogies kind of slow people up. But it's really intentional. There are these various patterns, and they all end, except for this one, in God's grace and his engagement with people and his saving people. Except at the end, we're waiting for something, and the waiting, we're rewarded, because chapter 12 begins the story of Abraham. So that theological pattern, I think, is what drives Genesis 1 through 11. We'll call it primeval prologue, but I think the theology of the literature. So what do you think? Does this make sense?
I think it's great, and I think how encouraging it would be to a group of slaves in Egypt who have gotten down there through one means or another, and they've been enslaved, and now Moses says, "Follow me, and we'll get you into a better place." And he tells these stories of what happened to their ancestors, and they think, well, maybe there's a chance that this will work out for us too.
No, and the stories are rescue stories
right.
from the most dire of circumstances.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know. Kent, what do you think?
Right, and really this pattern continues on through the Old Testament.
it does.
We see it in Judges, Kings,
Right.
and with a Christian perspective on through the New Testament.
Right.
So yes, I think it's important to recognize this early on.
So when we study Genesis 1 through 11, it's not just the scientific, the archaeological, the anthropology questions, it's the biblical text. We have to study it carefully too. And for the careful reader, it seems to me that there's this really positive, encouraging note.
The very interesting thing, as we all know, is that the Bible is not the only text that discusses these. We've got contemporary texts to the biblical text that tell many of the same stories. And so we have a context for the biblical stories that are set in ancient Near Eastern lore, and we prefer the biblical way of putting it, but the people who lived at the time, the Egyptians and the Akkadians, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, they all had similar stories. And so I know we'll eventually get to those.
Oh yes,
and look
when
for
we look at the creation stories in
Right.
particular and the flood accounts, because that's what seemed to show up
Right,
in these
right.
others. And we want to compare and contrast them and do that with them. So in this enterprise that we're beginning, going through the Bible book by book, but now especially in the very beginning chapters, how do we think about and how do we work with the Bible and the science, can we call it that? How do we deal with faith and reason, what we see, what we experience, what we can experiment with? How do we do that, especially at a time so long ago? I mean, this is our startup story. This is how we think about the origins, and it shapes everything about us. So when you start asking too many questions, is that dangerous? And does archaeology raise too many questions? I think that's really the question. How do we hold these two together?
And you know, from our mother's knee, we're told these stories in a certain way, and we picture them and we believe them, and then as we get older and learn that it's a little more complicated, that the texts need to be interpreted, just as science, and that needs to be interpreted.
Right.
And we have a revered spiritual leader in our communion that says that both science and the Bible have interpretation,
Important
and
to us.
looking for a way in which they
Right.
mesh
Right.
brings you to the best truth.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient. Keep believing and keep exploring. For Exploring the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.